I survived 200 days in All the Mods 9. All the Mods 9 is a massive mod pack filled to the brim with almost every type of mod. The final goal for the mod pack is to make an ATM STAR. In these 200 days, I built some of the craziest machines, conquered nature, mastered blood magic, and did so much more just to eventually craft an ATM STAR. Day 101 to day 102. Now with all the previous work done, it was time to actually get serious. I started off by moving through these mechanism quest lines. I just built the machines since I really didn't need to place them down and duplicate the ores. This took a little bit since some of the crafts were really tedious. Luckily, I had the autocraft set up for these alloys, which made it significantly easier. Before fully completing the quests, I made all the items needed to set up a fairly large thermal evaporation plant. To power the plant, I also crafted some heaters, and then I moved on to the final part of the quest line. For this, I made an osmium compressor and started crafting some refined obsidian ingots. All of this allowed me to craft the final basic machines, and now I was in the advanced section, which first needed lithium. These advanced machines generate so much energy, I wouldn't be able to use regular batteries anymore. To store all the energy, I needed a large induction matrix, and for that, I made myself a thermal evaporation plant. Just to start off, it was pretty small, but I smartened up and built it pretty high. The first one was to turn water into brine. The water would be pulled into the plant through a sink using an ultimate pipe. To power it up, I used a heater, and that thing basically maxed out the brine in seconds. Now, to turn the brine into lithium, I made the exact same thermal evaporation plant next to the first one. I connected the two up, hooked up a second heater to the back. Once the power was hooked up, I was now making liquid lithium. But the thing is, I actually needed lithium dust. To get this dust, I put down a rotary condensator and then a chemical crystallizer underneath that. This lithium setup would also be really useful for the best power source in the game much later. Once I hooked everything up, set up the inputs, and powered the machine, everything was good to go. At first, I tried using a drawer to collect the dust, but that really didn't work and it didn't connect to the actual controller, so I just had it output into an ender chest. After that, I put 4 muffling upgrades and 8 speed upgrades into both the machines. The speed upgrades actually caused power issues, so I also had to craft a bunch of energy upgrades. This did the job perfectly, and I was literally making hundreds of lithium dust a second. To make life much easier, I started making patterns for the induction providers and cells. I ended up making a pretty big mistake by putting this steel dust recipe in, but for now, things were fine. To end these days off, I put energy upgrades into all the mechanism machines in my basement and crafted these basic tier installers to upgrade all of these things as well. I got those machines up to advanced tier, which meant it could now process a ton more items at once. Day 104 to day 105, I upgraded the importer my ender chest uses so I could pull in items faster, and then put speed upgrades into all the crafters in the basement. Back to the big machines though, I started putting down more recipes for the bigger cells and providers, and these things were really expensive. I worked up to the ultimate version of each and noticed that I had enough items to actually start the autocraft. So here comes the first one of the issues. Since I didn't specify that one hammer could be used 64 times, refined storage would basically craft a new hammer for a single steel dust, which made the entire process take like 100 times longer. On the bright side, it was cool to see all the machines I had just start lighting up just to craft these 2 items. Then with all that going, I ended up grabbing a stack of all the modium from the mining dimension. The next morning, I grabbed the levels from the chunk destroyer, which got me up to level 164. I put all that XP into the crystal and only took back what I needed. This was just to increase some of the book levels on the enchantment library. That night, I upgraded the furnace up to netherite to speed it up, and that basically ruined the craft. I had to fix the inputs and basically restart the entire thing. So since I thought that I was being smart to let the system make the steel dust, that just ended up crafting me a bunch of iron hammers. Anyway, I stopped being an absolute idiot and stopped using those dust recipes. I just made the steel dust by myself, which wasn't even that much of a hassle. The funny thing is that now I had like 1,000 iron hammers. When I eventually asked the system to craft the induction cell and provider once again, it ended up being done in an instant. Anyway, I completed the quest for the cells and providers and then made all the other stuff that would be needed for the casing. With that done, I used the area behind my house and near the nether portal to set this induction matrix up for the first time. This one was just to get the quest reward, since I actually needed a much larger area for the huge machines that this thing was going to be getting the power from. I finished that little side quest, made a hazmat suit, and started setting up recipes for the fission reactor. The first 2 items were really cheap and I was able to upgrade to an all-the-modding furnace as well. Day 107 to day 108, I started up the lithium process again and saw that you could bulk wash magma blocks to get obsidian. Since I would need basically thousands of these, I wanted to get started on the create mod. For that, I had to go underground and look for more andesite. This actually took quite a bit of time and I was able to light up a bunch of areas inside of this cave. Still though, I couldn't find any andesite. Luckily, I got tons of diorite which allowed me to craft what I needed. From there, I also crafted an all-the-modium axe and tons of andesite alloys so I could get the andesite casings. With all that done, I could make an encased fan, which was supposed to be the first step to automating obsidian. I hopped into the nether to grab tons of magma blocks. This is when I realized create was going to be much harder than I thought, since I really didn't have anything that would generate stress units right now. Just to get things started, I made tons of brass casings and put in the recipes for regular and polished rose quartz. As soon as that was done, I crafted a bunch of mechanical crafters and placed those things down. To power these things, I tried using a hand crank, but of course that didn't generate enough stress. I even crafted a rolling mill because I needed copper wire. The main goal of all this was just to craft some electric motors. I ended up spending the whole night trying to power these crafters and nothing was working for now, so I knew I had to do more research. The next morning, I moved on from create and found an area to the north of my main base, and this place would be great for the mechanism machines. I cleared out the foliage, force loaded 2 chunks to start, and then flattened out the area. This is when things start getting a little complicated. I grabbed my reactor blocks and started working on a 5x5 little casing. After getting the outer shell ready, I placed reactor glass down and then made 2 fission fuel assemblies. Since I was missing some recipes, I placed a waystone down in this area and came home to cook up tons of lead. With all that done, I raised the fuel assemblies up and then placed control rods on top of each one. That was basically it for a small reactor, and all I had to do was just cover the whole thing up with glass and set up the inputs and outputs, which was super easy. Using a configurator, I was able to set the specifics of each of the 4 inputs and outputs. The main goal of this reactor was just to get nuclear waste. A great tip I learned was to use this EvilCraft external water block, and for that I made a dark gem block and used this EvilCraft beacon to capture some rain. This block was absolutely crazy and it filled up the reactor in a second. As I was working on this thing, I bought a sleep charm from a wandering trader, which was a lifesaver since it completely got rid of phantoms. Before even thinking of turning this thing on, I made 2 teleportation cores and used them to make 2 quantum entangleporters. Day 110 to day 111, from here, mechanism starts going crazy. I needed to craft fissile fuel, which was a pretty complicated process. I first started off by making all the machines I would need to get this thing up and running. This ended up taking some time, and I moved on to placing these machines down. The first thing I needed to do was actually make sulfur dust, so I placed down the 5 machines that would help me go through the entire process. From an external water block, I had water going into all the machines that needed it. Then I needed to feed this pressurized reaction chamber tons of coal. To do that, I used an ultimate logistical transporter and a chest, which all would be eventually hooked up to my system. So the first row of machines ended up being properly set up, which meant I could move on to a little bit more of the complicated process. In front of that first chemical infuser, I put down 2 machines, the most important being this chemical dissolution chamber. Now this machine uses a fluoride and is basically the end of this one process. There was another side to this entire system, which was to get something called uranium oxide. This thing only needed 2 machines and it just used regular uranium, which I had a bunch of. So the gist of the whole thing is that the uranium oxide from the left side of the machines combines with the hydrofluoric acid from all the machines on the right to make uranium hexafluoride inside of the infuser. It's all super complicated, but it's all in the quests. That uranium hexafluoride then goes into the centrifuge to make fissile fuel. For me, I basically had the fissile fuel go into the quantum entangleporter. With everything powered, it was now generating fissile fuel, and I could start the reactor soon. Just to be a completionist, I worked my way through the mechanism advanced quests as well. After just observing fissile fuel, those quests were done and I already had like 6,000 millibuckets of fuel. To automate these things, I went back to my base and crafted fluorite seeds. Just so I didn't have to worry about it again, I also wanted this master infusion crystal, but I only had enough materials to work my way up to a supremium one. Anyway, I upgraded the farmland and brought over a network receiver which I could use to hook up to all the chests. I made sure to move the cables near each one of the chests and hook them up using an exporter. Then I set the exporter to bring in coal, uranium, and fluorite. For the uranium and fluorite, I placed a crafting upgrade as well since I had the recipe set up. At this point, I already had 22,000 millibuckets of fissile fuel. For the second entangloporter, I put that one on the reactor and was able to fill up a quarter of the fuel tank. These machines, on the other hand, were basically ruining my ears, so I placed 4 muffling upgrades on all of them. Now that the basics were set up, I covered up the cables and placed a few speed upgrades into some slow machines. Since I basically had more than enough items, I also put down these energy upgrades into every machine and made this little area much more industrial. Next up, to harness the steam that comes from the reactor, I made a bunch of items for a turbine. A few blocks in front of this reactor, I built a slightly taller structure using turbine casings. In the center of this structure, I put down a few rotors and 6 blades. To finish this machine up, I put down tons of vents on top, a rotational complex above the rotors, and surrounded that with pressure dispersers and saturating condensers. The last 2 things needed were this electromagnetic coil and just putting glass all around the structure. Once I got the red particle effects, I moved one of the vents up and then connected the 2 machines together so that I could transfer steam into the turbine and could start generating a bunch of power from this thing too. Day 114 to day 115, with these 2 machines built, it was time for the basic induction matrix. I hooked this thing up to the turbine and put a flux plug on the backside. Since I had a single provider and cell, I was able to hold like 1.6 tera FE, which was a lot for the start. Still, I couldn't really start the reactor just yet since I didn't have a waste collection system. For that, I went to the end to mine unobtainium, but while I was there, I actually ran through this giant structure. After grabbing thousands of books, great armor, and even dragon heads, I moved on from this place. I then used the nature's compass, and turns out I was right next to an End Highlands biome, so I went straight to work. Here I absolutely shred through tons of end stone, but had no luck in finding the unobtainium. I decided to try again from another angle and found 2 pieces this time. With Fortune 5, I ended up getting 11 raw ores from that. Once I crushed it, I had 22 unobtainium ingots. Of course, the first thing I did was make a calcinated unobtainium powder and turn that into a charm of unobtainiumcite. With this, I hopped back into the End Highlands and started ripping through this biome, grabbing as many ores as I could. In total, I ended up with nearly 2 stacks, which of course I crushed and I smelted. I also needed more obsidian, so I snatched up a good amount from the end pillars. Once that was done, I crafted an entangled block and an entangled binder. Before setting up the waste collection, I wanted to grab tons of vibranium as well, so I warped over to the nether. I set up a compass to find a warped forest and started digging through some of the netherrack high up. On the first run, I couldn't find a single vibranium ore. Luckily, I checked my storage system and saw that I had 1 ingot. With that, I made a charm of vibraniumcite and went back to look. This one was significantly better, and I ended up with around a stack of ores from 1 biome. As soon as I came home, I crushed those ores and cooked them as well. At this point, I had hundreds of each of these althemodium ores. This was all because of the althemodium alloy block, which would be needed to actually start the ATM STAR. In total, I needed 28 of those alloy blocks on the outside of the mechanical crafters. So at first, I set up all the recipes and put them into the crafters so I wouldn't have to do it by hand when I actually did start working on this. To end this day, I flew back to the reactors, moved a few chunks away from the main area, and made a little island out of endstone bricks on the river. Once I lit the area up and mob-proofed it, I placed down a radioactive barrel and then binded it to this entangled block. This way, the nuclear waste would be processed somewhat far away from where I would actually be working. Finally, after all this work, this reactor was good to go once I had the cables hooked up. Day 117 to day 118, I made some last minute additions to the radioactive barrel and ran some tubes through, which would feed the waste into some machines. Turns out I didn't have any HDPE sheets, so first I had to set up all the machines that would churn that out. This actually took me quite a bit since I just winged it using JEI. I had the machine set up and the water coming through an external water block. After that was done, I set up the inputs and outputs and then went underwater to place down the cables to power this whole thing. By the next morning, I had all the cables sorted out and some carrots turning into biofuel and substrates. Most importantly, I was now churning out HDPE pellets, which would be enriched into actual sheets. Finally, I could craft this solar neutron activator, which would help me make one of the most important items, polonium. On the left side of this barrel, I had the machine churn out polonium pellets, and on the right side of the machines, I had it churn out plutonium pellets. Both those things were going to be needed to craft some of the most insane machines and mechanisms. I gave power to like 3 of these 4 machines since the solar neutron activator just needed the sun, and I had them output the pellets into a drawer. Then, since these machines both output spent nuclear waste, I set up more entangled blocks behind them. From wherever my original radioactive barrel was, I dug down very deep and placed down another barrel which I binded as well. After connecting that barrel to the 2 entangled blocks, I had a collection system for every type of nuclear waste. Just so you guys know, nuclear waste leaking from mechanism would be the worst thing to happen, so I was extra safe. With everything hooked up, I used this weather container to stop the rain and crushed a bunch of fluorite to make fluorite dust. After that, I put a few dusts into the pressurized reaction chamber and I activated the reactor. Things didn't blow up, so I knew it was working perfectly fine. The turbine was now getting steam and rotating the blades. This generated energy for the induction matrix. On the waste collection side, I was finally getting some nuclear waste as well. At this point, I was generating very small amounts of polonium and plutonium. To increase that, I started upping the burn rate of the reactor. I was able to turn it up to 6 millibuckets per tick, which was a huge upgrade for now. This turbine was also making tons of energy, so now I powered the entire fissile fuel process from the induction matrix. Turns out one of my machines actually kind of bugged out, so after fixing that, I had even more fissile fuel coming in, which meant I could increase the tick rate of the reactor up to 8, and that was a perfect place for now. On the other side, I started making tons more nuclear waste, which was a great sign, and the only limiting factor now ended up being the fluorite. Once morning hit, I had my first few polonium and plutonium pellets generated. I then sprinkled a few speed upgrades into the machines that sped up the fissile fuel production. With that done, I made even more fluorite seeds from mystical agriculture and crafted a network receiver and transmitter. This was so I could hook up these drawers to an external storage and have these pellets inside of my storage system. Since those processes would take a long time, I went back to the base and worked my way up to a master infusion crystal, and this thing was a lifesaver since I would be using mystical agriculture a lot. On top of that, I crafted like 81 prudentium growth accelerators and put them underneath the inferium growth accelerators. This was all before I actually supercharged the farm, so just wait for that. Once that was done, I used tons of fertilized essence to get more fluorite essence, so I could hopefully make tons more of those pellets. Day 121 to day 122, I went down to the basement and placed down another simulation chamber to help with the nether stars. I cleaned up the rest of the area and got my quest rewards for the pellets. Before making the super critical phase shifter, I really needed the fusion reactor. This was because the SPS eats up so much power, I needed the best reactor in the game to actually make the power. I had enough pellets to craft a good amount of blocks for the casings, but I just didn't have enough polonium pellets yet. Once again, to be safe, I crafted more fluorite seeds and upgraded the farmland while I was there. The next day, I went over to the deep dark area because I remember fighting slimes there and I really wanted slime pearls for those lily pads of fertility. This time I was very unlucky and couldn't find any of them. On the bright side, I crafted more fusion reactor frames and used a bunch of allthemodium ingots on these spawners to reduce the minimum spawn delay. To reduce the max spawn delay, I actually needed more unobtainium ingots. I also put wool into the spawners to make them silent and went over to the spent nuclear waste barrel to put down some reserves just in case. At this point, I was basically just waiting for more polonium pellets, so while that was happening, I hopped into the mining dimension and grabbed all the allthemodium ores left over. I also placed down more drawers and looked at all these GregTech ores to see which ones are useful. The ones that actually helped got put into the system. Before leaving, I increased the size that the chunk destroyer would work in and left. So as all these machines were working, I went underground to look for dark ores. This was because I really liked those external water blocks and they needed dark gems. I couldn't find a single dark gem, but I was able to make more fusion reactor frames down there. After a pretty good amount of mining, I came home and placed another crafter down. Inside of the crafter, I put down all the recipes that would be needed to craft a dimensional seed. The dimensional seed is one of the harder items to really get in this mod pack, and it was needed for the ATM star. In total, I would need around 500,000 dirt, netherrack, endstone, and emeralds. The rest of the items, like the obsidian and diamonds, I only needed 60,000 of, which was actually easy. In order to get some of these miniature portal things, I had to start upgrading the bookshelves. I made a slight mistake by making these blazing hell shells, so I would actually need to restart eventually. Anyway, I had even more inferium seeds planted, so I crafted more tertium growth accelerators and placed them down underneath the main crops. During that night, I was just one fusion reactor frame shy of having the entire thing ready to be built. Day 125 to day 126. I was really excited to craft this monster of a machine, and once the solar neutron activator woke up, I had all the items ready. Before that though, I did some research and found out how to make a proper mystical agriculture farm. I reconfigured the stone brick stairs on the farm and then waterlogged them. The goal was to fill the entire outside of the farm with lily pads of fertility. I made it look nice first and lit up the area. Then I upgraded some of the farmland to start and placed down more inferium seeds. With the new updates, this method is kind of nerfed, but to grab all the items needed for the lily pads, I crafted a slime gate pearl. I went to a flat area and summoned the waves. After destroying these mobs, I had tons of slime gate pearls, which I used to make fertilized essence. Then I was short on some creeper drops, so I also made a creeper gate pearl and did the same thing. Really quickly, I had to go over to a swamp biome to get a bunch of regular lily pads. While I was there, I decided to find a skeleton gate pearl for their drops as well. Then I figured out kind of like a cheat code. It was these large gate pearls, which I used for the creeper, and then I came home with like 8 lily pads of fertility. So this entire thing was designed by Alfred GG, so I'll leave the video in the description. At this point, I didn't know that the water can couldn't be automated anymore, so I still put down a modular router with a activator module and then placed a pretty high level watering can inside of it. The whole point of this machine was to basically automatically right click the watering can, but apparently it just doesn't work for ATM 9. I didn't know that, so I still put down some speed upgrades and a security upgrade into the whole thing. I moved on to something that did work though, and that was these giant gate pearls to get more mob drops. I did this twice and had 13 more lily pads, which helped tremendously. At this point, I was generating so many inferium essences, which allowed me to upgrade the farmlands and get rid of all the seeds I had in hopper botany pots. From there, I turned the thermal evaporation tanks back on and got rid of the chemical crystallizer since I just needed regular lithium. I fed that into a quantum entangleporter, and as that was filling up, I fought a giant creeper gate pearl. With all this, I had like 90% of the perimeter covered with these lily pads, and these seeds were growing very fast. Anyway, now that I had lithium, I crafted another quantum entangleporter and went over to my machines to craft one side of the fusion reactor. I just replicated that in the other 3 directions and then started putting the glass and ports down. By the time the next morning rolled around, I got the red particles to come out, which meant I had the multi-block structure set up properly. After that, I needed a few more things. First up was setting up a laser amplifier, which jumpstarts this machine. I had 3 lasers firing into one amplifier, which was redstone controlled. Once it holds 400 mega FE, it becomes usable. With that done, it was time for the fuel. On the right side, I used this quantum entangleporter to feed lithium into a solar neutron activator. This was to generate tritium. As soon as that was hooked up, I moved on to the right side where I made an electric pump which had a filter upgrade that would pull in heavy water. That heavy water goes into an electrolytic separator which generates deuterium. With both of those connected, I needed one more item, and this was called the whole room. I made 10 of them just in case. To power this thing, I had a chemical infuser in between these 2 fuel sources and put the whole room in the center to grab this thing called DT fuel. At this point, this reactor was fully operational. I just needed to wait on the laser amplifier to pick up 400 mega FE. While I was waiting for all that to charge up, I crafted more fluorite seeds, put speed upgrades into some machines, and looked at the mech suits. So for some reason, mech suits don't even show up with shaders, which meant I didn't even want to try to make them. Day 130 to day 131, with this laser amplifier holding 400 mega FE, I pulled the lever and got the fusion reactor started. From there, I started increasing the injection rate as I watched the fuel intake. I got up to 30 to start, and now the induction matrix was pulling in tons of power. Just to see how much I could push the reactor, I turned the rate up to 90, and noticed that the tritium was getting drained, so I brought it back down to 40. Since I didn't have to worry about power anymore, I started fitting more speed upgrades into the fissile fuel machines. With all that done, I started digging the dirt out of this area to make it look more industrial. I fit deep slate tiles on the outside and put down stone bricks for the rest. By the next morning, I had this area nice and clean, but for some reason the fusion reactor shut off, so I had to wait for the laser amplifier once again. At this point, I now had a stack of both polonium and plutonium pellets. Since I was progressing pretty well on getting antimatter, I decided to work on these alloy blocks again. For that, I made an agronomic source link and a bunch of source jars. At this point, because my farm was supercharged, I was generating source really fast. As morning hit, I started using these arcane pedestals to craft a manipulation essence. This was so I could make a tablet of containment and get myself an easy piglet form. So with the ritual brazier and a containment jar, I went over to an ancient pyramid. From here, I placed down a ritual brazier next to a jar and then put the tablet in it. Once that was done, I tried to move this piglet over to the ritual. It didn't really work this time since there were way too many mobs, so I decided to craft a mob yoinker and brought the piglet back to my base. I started the ritual once again, but this time against a fenced-in piglet, and it worked like a charm. This little guy was in a jar, and to extract the piglet hearts, I crafted a bunch of connected tinted glasses and built a little structure. I placed a jar and one mossy cobblestone down inside of it. Next up, I needed to find a drigme. I set up a little enchanting apparatus area and was able to put down every item other than the drigme charm. Finding the drigme turned out to be a pain, but on the bright side, I remembered to turn the fusion reactor back on. Deep into this flower field, I found one drigme who I threw a bunch of wild horns at. In this area, I got a few more drigme shards, and for some reason, this drigme charm wasn't being crafted. Turns out I was using an imbuement chamber and not an enchanting apparatus. Anyway, with that figured out, I summoned a few drigmes and wanted them to output to an ender chest. Almost immediately, things were working as I got 4 piglet hearts. Just in case, I made sure to put down a source relay in that area. I made a few more tablets of containment because drigmes are happier apparently when there are more mobs. Also around this time, I had close to 300 giga FE inside of the induction matrix. Day 135 to day 136, the next order of business was upgrading the storage once more, so I put down a recipe for a 4 million storage part. Turns out I was lacking silicon, so while checking out my farm, I decided to upgrade the farmland. This time I actually went out to grab poppies for red dye. So this red fertilizer thing on regular farmland apparently generates way more essences. For now, I only had 4 red fertilizers, and that inspired me to fight some skeletons in this gate pearl too. This way I could also fill out the lily pads of fertility. With that done, I ended up making a really good amount of insanium essences, which turned into 2 insanium blocks. This farm was pretty incredible now. At night, I started energizing some of all the modium and vibranium ingots together. This thing needed like 1 billion FE, but it should be worth it. I also set up the enchanting apparatus properly for a big ritual. While I was waiting for these alloy ingots, I contained a sheep and fitted in with a piglet. By the morning, I only needed a few more alloy ingots to get a brand new stack sword. This all the modium alloy sword did 52.5 attack damage. With that done, I upgraded the main crafters on my storage system to netherite. Then I hopped into the nether to look for a bastion. This was so I could get a vibranium smithing template. Inside of the first bastion, after looting the main chest, I found some suspicious soul sand hidden in a corner. Once I brushed that thing, I got the vibranium upgrade smithing template, and I just had to go to the other dimension for ancient stone to be able to duplicate it. With these new templates, I was able to upgrade my armor to vibranium and went back to the other dimension. Since I was already here, I wanted to look for a new dungeon so I could hopefully get the unobtainium smithing template as well. But I didn't know the name of it and accidentally went over to a piglin village. Turns out the structure I needed was just called the dungeon, and for some reason, I could not find it. Even with the structure compass, it was so far away. I stayed in this place for a little bit, fighting a bunch of piglitches and other mobs as well while I was there. Once I grabbed enough loot, I warped back home. Since I already started Ars Nouveau, I decided to beat the final boss of this mod as well. This guy was called the Wilden Chimera, and to summon it, I just put a few of the Wilden drops into a ritual brazier. Now I think this boss might have not been implemented correctly, since it looks completely different, but I was able to take it out really easily anyway. I picked up a Wilden tribute and some yellow hearts. Those hearts were clutch, so I took out 2 more of these bosses, and after that, I crafted some enchanted golden apples. This was since I could now make 10 yellow heart canisters and increase my hearts some more. Since my new sword was stacked, I wanted to put better affixes on it. I crushed a few gems and grabbed a few levels, but ended up finding a better affix for my pickaxe instead. From here, I ended up with 2 more insanium blocks and decided to craft all the modium seeds. This was kind of a mistake since vibranium was much rarer, and I learned that you can't grow this seed without a magical soil, which also needs 4 more insanium blocks. Anyway, I kept that in my system for now and mined a bunch of all the modium from the mining dimension. Since I was there, I filled up more drawers and came home to see 49 piglet hearts. To cover all the bases, I put another row of inferium seeds down and crafted these air seeds as well. The next morning, I crushed a bunch of fluorite, turned up the tick rate on the fission reactor, and upgraded more machines for fissile fuel production. That's not all though, I started the craft for the 4 million storage part, and this was a pretty hefty craft. In the meantime, I put in more recipes for a higher level storage, and put the 4 million storage part into the system. While the disk manipulator was working, I crafted an ultra version of this machine as well. This one was significantly faster, and after checking the requirements for the next upgrade, I noticed that I was only missing silicon. I decided to just burn through all the quartz I had in the meantime. That night ended up being a super blood moon, and since my base was mob proof, a ton of these poisonous labels spawned, and these little guys were super annoying. Day 140 to day 141, I started off these days holding on to the hope of this modular router working. Nothing worked still, so I moved on to productive bees. Just to get things started, I went to the nether and silk touch mined a quartz block. I turned that into a quartz nest and made some honey treats, but apparently these just needed quartz to attract bees. I snatched up 2 crystalline bees and turned them into Prospera bees. bees. Before moving on with the entire bees thing, I quickly made a detour to feed these Greg Tech quartz into the main system. Once all these cooked up, I had enough silicon to start crafting a 16 million storage part. As soon as this was crafted, I ran everything through the disk manipulator once again. Then for huge farm upgrades, I went around looking for any red flowers. I got a bunch of red poppies and also decided to craft a bunch of these upgrade installers as well. I managed to get all the machines in the basement up to ultimate tier, and with that done, I used the enrichment chamber to get a bunch of red dye. As soon as that was done, I replaced as much farmland as I could with these red fertilizers, and that did wonders. I was getting so much more Inferium essences. Later that night, I put another affix on the sword, which increases the chance of a loot pinata happening. Then I wanted an unobtainium upgrade, but no matter how far I went, I just could not find this stupid dungeon structure. I was flying for a really good amount of time and eventually just had to call it quits on this search. Back home, I placed down another Insanium block on the ritual pedestal and also placed down another simulation chamber in the basement. I then remembered to remake the hell shelves so I could just get one nether infused teleportation core. This process was actually super annoying since you need very specific amounts of Eterna, Arcana, and Quanta. I first infused all the hell shelves and then upgraded it to blazing hell shelves. After grabbing a ton more levels, I could now finally infuse these deep shelves and move on to the next tier. I had to hop back down into a deep dark biome to grab skulks, which allowed me to craft soul touched deep shelves. That's not all though, I upgraded it to soul touched skulk shelves as well. To make this whole setup work, I also needed melons, so I flew over to a jungle biome. Here I grabbed some and came home to start farming that. These melon shelves allowed me to reduce the quanta coming in from the shelves, which meant I finally hit the requirements to infuse this dragon's breath. Finally, after literally all that, I had end shelves. Day 144 to day 145, it took way too long, but I finally learned how to generate stress easily from the create mod. I'll leave a link in the description to the video. First, I crafted 9 empty blaze burners and then half a stack of these fluid tanks. I placed down these blaze burners in a 3x3 manner and then built the fluid tank right above that. From there, I used a sink to pull water onto the tank. With that up and running, I grabbed the blaze burners and went to fill them up in the nether. I grabbed 3 blazes and then realized I had blaze spawners in the mob form, so I used that instead. With that setup, I placed the filled blaze burners back down and used tons of coal to get some steam power working. To turn this into stress though, I had to craft a steam engine and then place a shaft on that. With that done, I placed down a gear shaft and had a rolling mill up and working. I used this to craft stacks of copper wire. With all that, I set up a few mechanical crafters and put down all the items needed to make an electric motor. To actually get things running though, I had to grab a bunch of kelp, which I cooked and turned into a belt. All that work paid off as I got my first electric motor, but to power the crafters needed for an ATM star, I would need a few more of these. In total, I got 5 electric motors just in case and started building the shape of the ATM star using the mechanical crafters. This ended up taking a good amount of time since I was just following the JEI, and after it was built, I went underground to grab more flux dusts. Turns out I only needed 3 electric motors cranked up to the max, and that did the trick, powering all these crafters. Now I just had to start placing down all the items to actually make the star. As soon as morning hit, I was also able to make a magical soil, which I put underneath some farmland and started growing all the Modium seeds. The essence of this seed only makes nuggets, so it wasn't too overpowered. With that done, I got rid of the house that the supply camp built all the way back in like day 10. I needed to clear this area to really start working on bees. The first thing I did here was place 3 sets of advanced beehives with expansion boxes. Then I lightly decorated the area and placed a network receiver down in front of the beehives. The bees I really needed were the draconic ones, so I crafted an obsidian nest and grabbed whatever was left of my dragon's breath. Before the day ended, I worked my way up these power quests, which helped me automate these nitro ender gates. These things are just basically better looking flux plugs. Day 147 to day 148, I crafted some more bee cages and made a nest locator. Then I went over to the nether to challenge a ghast gate pearl. After completing 5 waves, I had so many ghast tears, but all I needed was like 16 end crystals. From there, I went to the end to resummon the ender dragon. The whole time, I was just focused on getting as many bottles of dragon breath as possible. Once that was done and the dragon was taken care of, I placed this obsidian nest down and used the dragon's breath to help lure in draconic bees. I placed down a second nest to speed up the process and had like 3 draconic bees. Since I still needed 2 more, I did the dragon fight again for more dragon's breath. With the bees captured, I crafted a feeding slab and put it 1 block in front and under the hive. Since I didn't have a simulation upgrade yet, I had to carefully sneak the bees in. Once all 5 were in the hive, I went out to go look for regular bees to fill the other hive. The nest locator helped me grab one, and I kind of messed up using a feeding slab for these regular bees. For some reason, they just don't work too well. I had 4 regular bees inside one of the hives and went to automate these things. To automate it, I grabbed 2 exporters and importers and put them on the side of these hives. After connecting to the network, I had the hives pull in glass bottles and grab everything that was outputted. Things were working very well, so I also crafted a powered centrifuge for all the combs that I should get. After that, to get those ender gates to work, I had to start crafting these high-level ender cells. This took the whole night. As the morning started, I finally got a nitro ender cell and placed a nitro ender gate on the centrifuge. The only issue now was to actually get this ender cell thing to work. So it turns out I needed an energy cell as well to be able to use the ender cell, and that meant I had even more annoying items to craft. I didn't go all the way up to nitro. I stuck with a niotic energy cell since I really didn't want to craft any more items, and got the things to work finally. With this, I could use the really cool tiny ender gates instead of flux points. Now that the centrifuge was powered up, I wanted it to pull in all the combs and, of course, bring all the outputs back into the system. This entire bee operation was basically automated now. I then made a drawer for all the wax and was able to work up to 2 more insanium blocks. Then, in order to make all the alloy blocks, I was lacking more unobtainium, so I did a quick run of mining in the End Highlands biome. I picked up a stack and a half, which I crushed and smelted. Then I was only lacking piglet hearts. At this point, I noticed the regular bees were not working well, so I tried getting them out to see if I could reset them, and that aggroed a few. I ran away to stop them being angry, and was able to breed a few more bees as well. I still didn't know that the feeding slab was the issue, so I grabbed some extra flowers to put it inside of the slab. Oh yeah, at this point, ATM 9 had also been updated, and the fluorite changed, so I had to reconfigure this exporter for the fissile fuel machines. Turns out I had stocked up on polonium, so I put in some fluorite dust and had more than 200 pellets now. On top of that, my induction matrix was also completely filled up, so I needed extra providers and cells. I started the autocraft for those, which were significantly faster now. I had to wait till the next day for everything to craft, but once that was done, I made a much bigger induction matrix, which had room for even more providers and cells, just in case. This thing now holds 3.2 tera FE. After messing around with the reactor some more, I was able to craft my first draconic chunk. Now I needed a bunch of these for the productivity upgrades. With all the insanium I had now, I could also start working on the creative essence, which was needed for the ATM STAR. For now, I had the 4 insanium blocks. I also crafted a few speed upgrades and put those into the hives. Another thing I really needed was a time in a bottle, so I crafted 2 augments and did a ton of rituals to get them all the way to becoming speed 2 augments. With that, I finally got this time in the bottle, and this thing would be amazingly helpful for nether stars. I just had to wait for it to accumulate time. Day 152 to day 153, I started messing with the bookshelf setup once again to infuse some more dragon breath. With that, I could now make a nether infused teleportation core and of course craft a miniature nether portal. Turns out I was missing warped nylium. That was only one of the 9 items needed for the dimensional seed. For the ender infused teleportation core, I needed to go to the end and look for more dragon heads. I searched for some end cities and really didn't get lucky with the dragon heads, but I did find this ancient end city instead. This giant portal in the center brought me back to the main island. Before moving on, I tore through this one end pillar to get a bunch of obsidian, and then came home to craft this 5 times compressed end stone. Since I didn't have speed upgrades in that crafter, this actually took a good amount of time. The next morning, I made dirt seeds to hopefully get dirt blocks, but I eventually figured out a much better way to get dirt. Turns out I would need 175,000 dirt essences to make this 5 times compressed dirt block. Also during this time, I found a bunch of red bushes, which allowed me to craft even more red fertilizer. For netherrack, I also made nether seeds, but just like with dirt blocks, I found a much better way to get these as well. Since I'd been pretty busy, this time in a bottle had accumulated a good amount, which allowed me to speed up the simulation chambers a lot. Day 154 to day 155, I fit more speed upgrades into the hives, and after watching YouTuber Pilpo's ATM 9 series, I decided to craft an RF tools builder. I also had a netherite shulker box with a stack upgrade, and then decided to go to the mining dimension. So here, to get tons of netherrack and dirt, you first had to make a regular quarry and pick a very large area to clear out. The reason you do a regular quarry is because it replaces the mine block with dirt blocks. Doing this, I was picking up so much netherrack, it was pretty crazy to see. After that, I crafted even more stack upgrades and force loaded the chunks. The next step was to wait for this to finish and then use a clearing quarry to grab the leftover dirt. As all that was working, I made another Drigme charm to speed up the piglet heart process. Then I finally got my second draconic chunk, which allowed me to craft my first productivity upgrade, and these things start to scale really high. I put that productivity upgrade inside of the draconic beehive and went to speed up the RF tools builder. I already had close to 100,000 netherrack, so this thing was way better than the seeds. Since I was also getting close to the piglet hearts required, I wanted to try and activate this loot pinata thing for my sword on a piglet. This ended up being a waste of time since I spent 5 minutes fighting these 2 mobs and only picked up 7 hearts in total. Anyway, after that I sped up these simulation chambers and almost had 300k netherrack at this point. From there, I smartened up and made vibranium seeds, and these things are going to be significantly more useful than the aldemodium seeds. Now, since I already had a good amount of pellets, I went over to start making more HDPE sheets. At this point, I had 300 plus polonium pellets, which should be more than enough to make all the SPS items. Since I was already in the area, I wanted to upgrade the induction matrix once more and crafted more ultimate providers and cells. At this point, I also ended up with a 400k netherrack, which I then filtered into an ender chest. The problem was, this kinda clogged the main ender chest up with all the netherrack. I had to upgrade the importer to the mega version and clear out some of the items manually every once in a while. Luckily, after all this, I didn't have to run the RF tools builder ever again. Day 157 to day 158, at this point I was only missing 17 more piglet hearts to craft the 28 alloy blocks needed. While I was waiting for that, I went over to the builder, which was done, and decided to swap to a clearing quarry to grab all the dirt left over. I was still missing some netherrack, but with this method it would be pretty easy to get the rest. Anyway, as thousands of dirt blocks poured in, I decided to craft even more data modules. From here, I grabbed a bunch of wither skeleton skulls, summoned some withers, and constructed a few more wither data modules. I leveled them all up a tier and used the right side of my basement to place down even more simulation chambers. I powered everything up, hooked them up to the exporters and importers, and then finally put the data modules in. After that, I cleaned the area up and used the time in the bottle to advance the simulation chambers. Inside of the storage system at this time, I had almost 500,000 netherrack and almost 300,000 dirt blocks. One of the items that would help with the ATM STAR was this focus of summoning, which I actually had all the items for. The next day, I was raking in more dirt blocks and was able to craft my first few Insanium gemstones. I then hopped into the end dimension to look for more end cities. As soon as I ended up grabbing some dragon heads, I came home to make a draconic end shelf. Turns out I would need a few more of these to get the ender infused core. But on the bright side, I could finally start the autocraft for the 28 unobtainium alloy blocks. These things needed like 8 billion FE each. Luckily, that didn't even dent the induction matrix. Since I was back in the reactor area, I also crafted 60 SPS casings, 120 reactor glasses, and 3 SPS ports. All that plus 2 supercharged coils, I had all the items needed to start making antimatter. Day 160 to day 162, to set this machine up, I had to be very careful. I first shut off some of the nuclear waste machines. Then I assumed that you could put polonium into a quantum entangloporter, so I built this supercritical phase shifter one chunk away from my other reactors. Building it was pretty annoying since it was a fairly large machine, but the practice was nice. It was nighttime when I finally saw the red particles pop up, and from there I hooked up the quantum entangloporter on both areas, but of course that didn't work. So by next morning, I cleared out the old machines in the area and built another little endstone island on the chunk right next to me. With that done, I rebuilt the entire SPS machine once again and brought the polonium over from the solar neutron activator. I plugged in the power behind the supercharged coils and powered the chemical crystallizers as well, which actually makes the antimatter pellet. I thought this machine wasn't working at first, but it turned out that I didn't allow the flux plug in the induction matrix to go over the limit. I figured it out the next morning and saw that the SPS was pulling 100 million FE per tick. I turned the injection rate up for the fusion reactor and set more realistic limits for the SPS. It was now only pulling in 10 million FE in total. To help with the power generation, I placed down another electric pump to get in more heavy water to fuel this fusion reactor up even more. This allowed me to increase the injection rate, and I had 30 millibuckets of antimatter already. Mind you, I need around 1,000 millibuckets for a single antimatter pellet. At this point, I had built and got most of the very long processes ready. I was even able to make a second productivity upgrade as well. Around these days, I had updated the mod pack once again, and there was now a new section for all the modium. After looking through the quests, I ran the normal quarry on a large section of netherrack once again. That finished very quickly, so I did it again for the other side, and at this point I was very close to crafting the 6x dirt block and the 6x netherrack. I ended up doing one final run, and I started the craft for those 2 blocks after that was done. As the auto crafter was working, I set the chunk destroyer to mine 20 chunks in 3 different directions. Since the main chest was almost filled up, I placed down more drawers which all had upgrades in them, and that basically pulled all the good items that were left over. From there, I used this time in a bottle to increase the nether star production and went to check out the antimatter. I only had like 70 millibuckets so far. As for the ATM star, I was kind of close to making this dragon soul. The recipes for this wasn't too hard to get. First, I needed a dragon's tooth, so I crafted a purple knife. I had to resummon the ender dragon and take it out using this knife to get 1 dragon's tooth. With this thing, I now had the non-hatchable dragon egg immediately. I was only 4 more items away from the dragon soul. During this night, I swapped around the recipes to make the full all the modium alloy blocks instead of just the ingots first, and it worked out much better in the long run. From there, I also crafted more insanium gemstone blocks and was much closer to the creative essence as well. The next day, I learned that I could make the 3x diamond block as well, and this meant I only needed emeralds and obsidian, which just happened to be the hardest things to get. Since I had spare unobtainium, I went over to the Vindicator spawners and reduced the max spawn delay. To help get even more emeralds on top of that, I grabbed 9 more looting 1 books and turned them into looting upgrades for the mob masher. With that done, to show the beast some love, I crafted a few more upgrades. I made this anti-teleportation one because it was going to be needed for the simulator upgrade later. That night, I had more regular bees coming into the beehive and also crafted more insanium gemstone. Later on, I ended up with enough dragon chunks to make more productivity upgrades, and this finally allowed me to get to the next tier. To be safe now, I also fit in a simulation upgrade into the draconic beehive as well. Day 166 to day 168, so I AFK'd for a good while, which allowed the system to craft up to 25 all the modium alloy blocks. As the last 3 were energizing, I also made a supremium water can to use on the farm. This sped up the supercharged farm even more. I broke the modular rooters and crafted earth seeds as well. I needed all these nature essences for the awakened rituals later. From there, I planted 2 obsidian seeds as well to help with this dimensional seed. Things were still processing at this point, so I set up this awakened altar and the pedestals. At night, there happened to be a harvest moon, so I just sat there watering the farm for a good amount of time. In order to get some awakened blocks, I had to start making these mystical agriculture swords. I worked up to a tertium sword and then enchanted it. I actually needed an enchant called Mystical Enlightenment. On the second try, I got what I needed, but this sword also had Knowledge of the Ages, which I didn't realize just yet. That meant when I summoned the withers to try and get Cognizant Dust, I only managed to get XP, so I had to disenchant the sword and re-enchant it. By this time, the 28 alloy blocks were done, and I placed them in a chest in front of the crafters for now. I asked the system to also make 2 vibranium alloy blocks after that. While that was energizing, I finally grabbed a bunch of Cognizant Dust. Back home, I was just a few insanium shy of this creative essence. So the reason I actually didn't put the alloy blocks into the crafter was because I still needed these crafters to make a Patrick star. And this thing was really straightforward to make. I crafted all of the concrete, and then I enriched a bunch of flowers to make the dye, which allowed me to make the concrete powders. Then, since I had a bunch of water essence, I could just make regular concrete with that, and I rinsed and repeated for each of the colored concrete. The hardest part of this entire process was just putting the right blocks in the right slots. That process actually took me an embarrassingly long amount of time, but I now had 2 of the 12 things needed for the star. From here, I picked up the vibranium alloy and now needed to make these awakened through a ritual. This was actually really easy, and I finally started slotting stuffs into the crafter, which looked really cool. Around the outer perimeter, I put the unobtainium alloy blocks, then I put the awakened vibranium in. Around this time, I was only 1 insanium gemstone shy of the creative essence, but I needed more prosperity shards. To get that, I decided to just place these Prospera bees into the hive and of course automated the process. I did a quick run through the caves as well, which managed to get me a prosperity gem block and finally a creative essence. At this point, I had 3 of the 12 items needed for the ATM star. The next morning when I checked my antimatter, I had up to 150 millibuckets, and I noticed my induction matrix was full, so I slotted 1 more set of providers and cells. Since I could fit a few more, I decided to auto-craft those, and while doing that, I noticed I had some evoker spawn eggs and more vindicator spawn eggs as well, so I swapped out some spawners for these. Before upgrading the induction matrix, I slotted in 1 more looting upgrade into the mob mashers. At this point, my matrix now held 6.4 Tera FE, With more energy storage, I decided to increase the tick rate for my fusion reactor, but to help with the fuel, I crafted another electric pump which pulled in more heavy water. That night, I also made dragon egg seeds and a dragon egg crux. With this, I could make dragon heads at home and upgraded all the bookshelves. Day 171 to day 172, after more finicking of the bookshelves, I finally got this ender-infused teleportation core, which allowed me to make a miniature end portal. At this time, there was another update in the mod pack, so I had to link all the drawers to the storage system once again. With that being done, I made tons of lily pads of fertility and started on this Forbidden and Arcanus mod. So I was actually planning on making another 9x9 farm, but at this time, these gate pearls got nerfed, so I couldn't make the lily pads quickly. Anyway, when I got back home, I started crafting a bunch of items for this philosopher's fuel, which didn't look super expensive. It was a little tedious just crafting all these stupid furnace types. Once morning hit, I let all the regular bees out and finally got rid of the feeding slab, which actually started getting me some real honeycombs. With that done, I used this cognizant dust to make a block of awakened supremium, and with that, I upgraded my watering can, which I had been using on my farm for quite a bit. I also made another block of awakened supremium, and that night, I placed down recipes for a dragon head. Since the last update, my reactor was shut off, so I started the process back up. I also had 216 millibuckets of antimatter so far. I ended up adding one more simulation chamber inside of the basement and cranked this thing up using a time in the bottle. As I was waiting for this laser amplifier, I set down even more electric pumps to help with more fuel. This was all just so I could crank up the fusion reactor. Every chance I got, I sped up the simulation chamber as well, which pumped out tons of these weather prediction matrices. I used the watering can for a few minutes that night and then created a portal to the Twilight Dimension. In here, I needed the Snow Queen's head and a bunch of metals. To help with the emerald grind some more, I made some emerald seeds, and with all this new additions, I actually had 160k emeralds and 25k nether stars, but I was still nowhere close to making the respective items needed. In the meantime, I made 3 more obsidian seeds, which should help greatly. That night, I had a few draconic chunks, which meant more productivity upgrades, but these ones just fit into the regular beehives. Finally, I could now crank up the fusion reactor all the way up to like 80 and still have tons of fuel coming in. This meant I could now increase the limit on my SPS. At this point, I started running low on tritium, so I made 2 more solar neutron activators to help churn those out. These days, I was mainly just waiting on a bunch of items to process. Day 176 to day 178, if the game looks any different at this point, it was because I had a 1440p monitor now. Anyway, a few of my drawers in the mining dimension were getting filled up, so I snuck in some netherite upgrades on them. Then to check off a bunch of items, I had to go to the Twilight Dimension. I started off by just following the quest lines. Using a structure compass and glitch flying, I beat the Naga. Then I made my way to the Lich Tower, and this fight was a little annoying, but after taking down the skeleton's clones, I had 2 bosses done. Next up, I flew into the swamps and hopped down into this labyrinth. In here, I grabbed a bunch of ironwood ingots and started looking for more minotaurs. After grabbing tons of mushrooms, I actually decided to upgrade this one minotaur spawner. This was all just so I could get this maze map focus and progress the quests. As soon as that was done, I took out the boss and ate the meat stroganoff. From there, I made my way over to the Hydra, who I was able to take out using my sword. I got tons of fiery blood, which was an essential item, and moved on to the next essential area. So in total, I had 7 fiery ingots, but I needed 9. Then, to get this block of night metal, I had to take on this night stronghold, which has a chance of not even spawning the bosses properly. Some of the mobs inside drop items that could be smelted into night metal, which was really nice, and I got lucky finding the boss area on my first try. These night phantoms were very easy to take out, and I moved on to the dark tower. Inside of the tower, I took out some mini ghasts and drew the Urghast in. I took this guy out in a few swings and got even more fiery blood as a reward. With that done, I had 2 of the major items crafted, a block of fiery metal and a block of Carmonite. From there, I took out the Alpha Yeti really quickly and went over to the Snow Queen. At first, I tried using the containment ritual on the Snow Queen, but I just could not get this thing to work. Instead, I decided to just defeat the boss and pick up 1 head. When I came home, I made a block of night metal and did a ritual to craft this miniature Twilight Forest portal, which was needed for the Philosopher's Fuel. To check off 1 more item, I crafted a metal alloyer. Using this machine, I synthesized like 12 Tyrian steel and made a block of Tyrian. From here, I worked my way up through these mystical agriculture furnaces and just had to do some rituals to awaken it. Since I didn't have any prosperity shards left over, I had to craft some other items. The next day, I hopped back into the mines to grab a bunch of prosperity shards and some fluorite while I was there. I then came home, and made the Awakened Supremium Furnace. At this point, I could also make this Diorum block and an Insanium coal block, which meant I was very close to getting this Philosopher's Fuel. One of the main items was a Rainbow Furnace, which actually wasn't too expensive. I would slowly work my way through that, and the last two items of this craft happened to be inside of the mods Evil Craft and Extreme Reactors, which I would have to focus on later. Before this day ended, I increased the limit for the SPS once again and threw down another Solar Neutron Activator for Polonium. Around this time, I also had 400 millibuckets of Antimatter. Day 180 to day 181, another pretty simple item to get was this Oblivion Shard, and to start that, I went over to the end and picked up these Rows of Oblivions. From there, I went around these biomes looking for any golden trees, but I couldn't find any. Instead, I spawned these updated gate pearls, and these enemies were significantly stronger now. Even in vibranium armor, I was actually taking some damage from the bigger slimes. That night, I opened another random gate pearl, and this one just stopped out of nowhere. I ended up being close to a Blue Skies villager, so I bought a blue journal and this zeoliter. The next day, I was back inside of the Twilight Forest biome trying to trap this Snow Queen so I could contain her, but that didn't work once again. Instead, I grabbed her DNA with the mob swab and then took her out. When I came back home, I made a chicken feed with the DNA and got the spawn egg. I used the egg on the spawner and picked up the second head, which meant I only needed 2 more items for the dragon's soul. Around this time, I also learned how to get bottled darkness, so I went over to the end once again with a bottle and a cork. Using that on this dragon's breath got me what I needed. From there, I came home and made this brilliant fiber, which would convert regular leaves into golden leaves. I planted some oak trees and used this fiber on the leaves. From there, all I had to do was just wait for golden particles to show. The next morning, I cleared out a good little area behind my base, which I force loaded as well. While that was working, I planted these Demon's Dream Seeds to get demon fruit. After lighting that fruit on fire, I could throw andesite into the flame, which crafted other stones. Using these stones, I made these sacrificial bowls to properly start occultism. I also made this Binding Book of Genie. From there, I grabbed a few quest rewards and finally these gold leaves. I had more than a stack of gold leaves, which I used to make 8 wooden stands. I decided to set up the gold powder first, then the stands after that. It took a few tries, but by the morning I had my first ritual started and grabbed 1 environmental eye. With that, I crafted 1 world's eye and did the ritual again. From there, I only needed eternal stellas to craft this Oblivion Shard. After that, I put down an extra productivity upgrade in with draconic bees. Later that day, I used one of these books to set up the outline for an occultism ritual. At this point, I was only able to make impure white chalk and golden chalk. Day 184 to day 187, after some more research, I decided to do the ritual to summon a crusher first. Turns out you only need a regular crusher to get the endstone dust, so I gave this little guy a stack of endstone to work on. Finally, I got the purple chalk and started doing the ritual that gets me the empty soul gem. This was very easy. I just used the book to set up the outline and JEI to find which items were needed. Once I placed the bound book down, I waited for the ritual to start, and it used up all the items I had placed down. With the empty soul gem crafted, I was only waiting on these draconic chunks, so I decided to move on to Forbidden and Arcanus in the meantime. To get these eternal stellas, I crafted some polished darkstone and a few arcane polished darkstones. It took until the next morning for me to get the setup of this ritual area. I'll leave all the videos I used down in the description once again. With this area set up, I placed down a smithing table in the center and right-clicked it with this dust to turn it into a tier 1 Hephaestus forge. To fill these things up, I grabbed tons of bottles of enchanting, then some test tubes for blood, and started brewing a bunch of potions of regeneration. All those regen potions were used to make bottles of Oriel. Now for blood, I tried holding the test tube on my offhand and fighting through an ancient pyramid, but that didn't work. Instead, I decided to grab a spawner, fence that little ritual area off, and put the spawner on top of the forge. I saw some people saying that zombie piglins generate a lot of blood, so I grabbed the DNA for those guys and made the spawn eggs. I sped the spawners up, placed a dragon egg inside, and started filling up the blood section of the forge. With that done, I placed these darkstone pedestals around and went looking for a dark forest so I can get some Edelwood logs. Using that, I made a soul extractor and picked up soul from soul sand. At this point, I had everything I needed to upgrade the forge 1 level, well, everything but the aurora crystals. To get that, I went down to the deep dark chasm and mined for a good little bit. When I came back home, I also had enough aurora crystals for 2 blocks and 21 left over. I decided to craft an obelisk which actually generates Oriel automatically, but at this point I had no clue how to use it. While gathering the Oriole needed, I was able to make an inactive dragon egg, which was the last item needed for this dragon soul. I put that right into the crafters and was making some good progress. Day 187 to day 189, I figured out how to set up the obelisk and could now use the time in the bottle to stack the Oriole up. When I had enough items, I did the ritual to upgrade this forge to tier 2. To get to tier 3 was pretty much the same. I maxed the blood out, then set up the obelisk to generate Oriole. While that was working, I placed down a stack of soulstone and extracted as many souls as I could. I was still short some aurora crystals, so I hopped back down into the deep dark chasm. In here, I found my first Stellar Arcanum as well, which was really clutch. I was mining for a good little bit, which helped me get a ton of crystals and 4 Stellarite pieces. With that, I upgraded the forge to tier 2, then I started filling up the required materials once again. With everything set up, I made my first Eternal Stella. Turns out I had more than enough items to make 4 Eternal Stellas, and by nighttime, this Oblivion Shard was crafted and placed inside of the mechanical crafter. Before the night ended, I placed down a bunch more obsidian seeds into the farm and now had 21,000 obsidian blocks. Day 190 to day 192, I made these Supremium growth accelerators and placed them underneath all the other ones. The problem was that I think these things barely sped up anything. Since I was already getting pretty close to the obsidian, I wanted to also enhance the emerald farm, so I improved a bunch of the spawners and then enchanted more tomes so I could have looting books. Every single mob master at this point had looting 4. With that done, I wanted to work on Evilcraft so I could get this rejuvenated flesh. But before focusing on that, I noticed one of my crafting recipes for the storage part was not working well. I had to craft like 72 of these 256k storage parts by itself. That ended up taking 10 whole minutes to finish, and for some reason, this 65 million storage part just wasn't recognizing the other items. For the rest of day 192 to day 195, I moved on from that and went looking for dark gems. I spent basically a whole day down in the mines. In between the mining, I actually manually crafted higher level storage parts, and that allowed me to get the massive storage upgrade. Also during this time, I finally found these dark ores, which was huge. I ended up with 45 dark gems. From there, I made some spikes and crafted 9 blood extractors, which I combined into one large one. Some of the quest rewards also gave me a dark tank as well, which was my sign to come back home. As I let the storage parts run through the disc manipulator, I built off a little fenced area with a spawner in the center. After that, I upgraded to an Archmage spellbook and put down a scribe's table. With that, I threw in all the items needed to make a glyph of lightning. I used a spellbook to create a spell of projectile lightning. From there, I upgraded the spawner and grabbed some villager DNA. I turned the spawner into a villager one and placed down some random villagers inside just to help me out. After using a lightning spell on them, they became werewolvians who turned into werewolves during a full moon. I traded these guys a bunch of poison sacks for emeralds, and since it wasn't a full moon yet, I just decided to kill as many villagers as possible to fill up this blood extractor. During this time, I upgraded the dark tank and created a little area to place down 5 buckets of blood. With that done, I threw in 1 dark gem to get a dark power gem and left just 1 single bucket of blood to harden up. In the meantime, I went right back to filling up the dark tank for later. As soon as the blood hardened, I snatched that up and cooked it to get this blood infusion core. All of this was just to get a blood infuser, which I actually needed to max out. One of the quest rewards gave me a vengeance essence, which was a pretty great reward for this mod. To get the first upgrade, I needed 3 dark power gems, which allowed me to get the Dusted Bowl of Promises. After infusing that and a block of iron, I crafted the Promise of Tenacity 1. I had to get that all the way up to level 3 to make rejuvenated flesh. The second tier upgrade was basically the same thing, but with gold blocks and double the blood. Tier 3 was pretty expensive, so I spent a whole night slaughtering villagers. By the morning, I had a very efficient villager slaughtering machine. Finally, I got the Promise of Tenacity 3, which allowed me to get this thing called Garmin Bosia. The last thing I needed after that was werewolf flesh, so I just made a bunch of werewolvians and was gonna wait for a full moon. For the rest of day 195 to day 198, I learned that Minecraft had like tons of moon cycles, so I had to wait for a bit. I decided to move on to the next item, which was in the mod Extreme Reactors. Now I'm just gonna leave the video down below on how to get this block since it was unnecessarily complicated. I'll try my best to explain it though. The first thing I did was start working on the chunks right next to my mob farm. At this point, I had already made tons of graphite and built a very small 3x3x3 reactor. After putting all the required blocks down, I slotted in uranium ingots as fuel in the back. Now this reactor was super slow. Basically, I just needed this thing to start making cyanite, which you need tons of to make the very important machines. To be safe, I also picked up a ton of yellorium ingots, which will be needed much later. As this very slow process was going on, I sped up the farm and checked out some of my machines. My induction matrix was full, so I increased the limit on the SPS casing. At this point, I had 600 millibuckets of antimatter. To help me out some more with the insanite stuff, I made a second reactor in front of the old one to to do the same process. After a good amount of time, I had 4 cyanide ingots and then just decided to make the second reactor much bigger. This one was also much more efficient, and since I needed stacks of cyanide ingots, I wanted to make a cyanide bee. To do that, I snatched up one of my bees and turned it into a creeper bee. From there, I spammed honey trees onto a gravel nest to get an ashy mining bee. I put that bee and a crystalline bee into a breeding chamber to get the iron bee. Finally, after all that, I bred the iron bee and the cree bee together to get a radioactive bee. I incubated this little guy, made some productivity upgrades, and had enough cyanide to get a block's worth. I managed to fit a gamma level productivity upgrade into the draconic beehive, and then picked up my first cyanide bee. At this point, I also had another cyanide, so I put that into a feeding slab. For the rest of day 198 all the way to day 200, I used these new cyanide ingots, and I started crafting these reprocessor casings. I was only able to build the base right away. After that, I added a simulation upgrade to the cyanide beehive, which kind of changed everything. I now had tons more cyanide, and I crafted a few blocks of these ingots, which helped me do the ritual for cyanide seeds. I started spam farming these and made the first full reprocessor. I filled this thing up with water and could now make plutonium, which was just step 1. Next up, I made a 3x3x3 fluidizer, which was supposed to make liquid cyanide. This one took a little bit of tinkering to get just right. From there, that liquid cyanide has to be the base of another reprocessor. See what I'm saying? This whole process was super annoying. As I made more cyanide seeds, I noticed that I could finally craft this 5-time obsidian block as well. With this new reprocessor setup, I started taking in liquid cyanide, and I could now turn plutonium into lutecrite. That was just step 2. To put this lutecrite to use, I made a 5x5x4 reinforced reactor. Now this much bigger reactor takes in plutonium and spits out magentite. Right next to it, I had to build a reprocessor once more. This reprocessor now takes in the magentite as a base and uses the lutecrite ingots to make radiculite ingots. Right across these machines, I was building the last few things. The first was a 5x5x4 fluidizer. This machine has 2 inputs, one for yellorium and the other for plutonium. As this fluidizer started making verderium, I moved on to the final 2 machines. One of them was another 5x5x4 reinforced reactor, which took in the verderium. In front of that machine was the last reprocessor, which takes in the rosinite from the reactor. Finally, with all of that, I set up the radiculite to start processing inanite ingots. With these inanite ingots done, I threw in these things called beniatites, which generated the insanite. All of these were used to make an inanite block, then an insanite block, which allowed me to craft the philosopher's fuel. I put that onto the mechanical crafters and was halfway towards an ATM star. There were still tons of mods left for me to go through, so let me know if you want 300 days.